Welcome, and in this chapter we're going to be going over the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires. And this is the lecture on chapter 28. So this first lecture is going to focus mostly on section 1. And I want you to also know these as the Islamic gunpowder empires. So I want you to keep that in mind because gunpowder is going to play a role in empire building during this time. So to prepare for notes, I want you to create a 4-square chart, 1 square for each of these empires, and leave 1 for the summary. In each box, focus on the organization of the empire, like how they got to power and how they ruled, how they administered their realm, as well as, maybe some of the major political challenges they faced. So we're going to start with the Ottoman Empire. And you can see from the map here, the Ottoman Empire was an empire that was slow to grow. It begins in the late 1200s, and it's constantly growing until the 1600s. So you can see the different colors here on the map, and its origins in Anatolia, right in the center, and it begins to expand outward, and because of the use of gunpowder. So this empire was founded in 1289 by Osman Bey, and Osman Bey was a Turk who had led the Turks from Central Asia into Anatolia. Now, by the time the Ottomans are migrating into Anatolia, they are already converted to Islam. Turkish people had long been in contact with Muslims since the rise of the Abbasid Empire in Persia, and so they had already been converted to Islam long before the Ottomans. And we'd studied the Seljuk Turks a little bit, and we even saw the Ottomans in chapter 18. So his empire was growing on the borderlands of the Byzantine Empire. So this is the Byzantine Empire. This is the Roman Empire after the fall of Rome. So after they lost control of the western part, which included Spain and what is modern day France, back then was called Gaul, all the way up to England, the Roman Empire had collapsed in the west in the year 476, but it continued out of the city of Constantinople that you could see in the map right above where it says Asia Minor. So that was the new capital of the Roman Empire. But you could see by 1316, only the dark purple shaded area had remained. The rise of Islam had already threatened the Byzantine Empire long before. So Muslim conquerors had already conquered North Africa, they had conquered Spain, they had conquered Persia. And then the Seljuk Turks began to expand into Anatolia, which is what this map says Asia Minor. I want you to know these two regions on this map. Where it says Asia Minor, that's called Anatolia. So know the name of that landform. And the other peninsula just to the west of that is the Balkans, the Balkan Peninsula. So you want to know that peninsula that's surrounded by the Black Sea, the Aegean and Mediterranean Seas, and the Adriatic Sea. So here's another look at the Ottoman Empire. So you can see then how similar the lands were. So from 1300 on, it's expanding, and the Byzantine Empire is getting smaller and smaller while the Ottoman Empire is growing and growing. In 1326, the Ottomans captured the town of Bursa. So you could see the zoomed in portion of the map here. That's a close-up of Anatolia, where Anatolia meets the Balkan Peninsula. In 1352, they take Gallipoli, and this begins to attract more religious warriors, or Ghazi. So more people begin to join the empire. And then they crossed into what is Europe. The Balkan Peninsula is in Europe. Istanbul is a city today that you can see here straddles Europe and Asia Minor. And if you were to zoom in, you would actually see there's a strait, so you can actually sail from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean Sea. And that's why the port of Istanbul was so important. So after they get into the Balkans, Edirne, the city, becomes the base for expansion into the Balkans. And so you can see that here. Again, take a look at the map. The map that's in green, you can see where Edirne is. So that's now on the European part of the Ottoman Empire. And that became the base to expand into Bulgaria, into Romania. Taking a look at the large map here, you can see where it was in 1300. The yellow where it says Turks, that's the Ottoman. And the descendants of Mongols, the Mongol hordes in Russia, the Golden Horde was still around in Russia in 1300. And the Byzantine Empire was still around. But all of this that you see here, where you see the Byzantine Empire, Bulgaria, Serbia, Bosnia, Hungary, those are all going to be regions where the Ottoman Empire will expand. One of the keys to the expansion was an effective military organization. It was organized with two units of cavalry, which was on horseback, and infantry, and they were the Ghazi, they were the religious warriors. The cavalry was financed by land grants. So in order to continue to grow your military, you needed to continue to have land to grant to these soldiers. But the most important forces were the Janissaries. Okay? And so the Janissaries were a group of soldiers that were well disciplined and very effective. And they were equipped with gunpowder. And like I mentioned at the beginning, gunpowder empires are the type of empires we're going to see in this unit. So when we talk about the early modern period, here's another thing you want to know, especially for the upcoming exam. The early modern period refers to the period from 1450 to 1750. And the main method of state building at this time is going to be with the use of gunpowder. The Tokugawa shogunate in Japan unified Japan because they had gunpowder. The Qing dynasty was able to extend control and take over the Ming lands because of gunpowder. The Portuguese ships in the Indian Ocean were able to establish ports because of gunpowder, as well as the Dutch and the British ships. And so here we're going to see gunpowder play a role also in the building of the Islamic empires. Now, one system you have to know, that's usually one of the required materials for the AP exam, is understanding this system called the Dev-Shirme system. And this was a recruitment system. It was like a child, they called it like a child tax essentially, where they recruited young Christian boys forcibly, right? They took them from the Balkan, from the Christian people in the Balkan Peninsula, and then they traded them. They became slaves to the Sultan. They converted to Islam, they learned Turkish, and they became loyal servants. And then some served as civil servants, and some served as Janissary soldiers. So this was a method that was devised by the Ottoman sultans in order to recruit a force loyal to him. Because the Ottomans come from Turks, they are Turks, they bring with them the Turk traditions of the steppe lands. People that were semi-nomadic Turks have a tradition of being loyal to a clan, right? So blood is everything. And as a result, a lot of the nobles, right, would undermine the authority of the sultans of the Ottoman Empire by demanding the loyalty of the military to them because it's their clan, right? So there's a potential for instability. And so in order to consolidate power, so here's, when we talk about, as we move closer to the exam that you're going to take next week and what you're going to need to know for the AP exam, you're going to want to know how to compare these methods of consolidating power. And we talked about, like in the Tokugawa shogunate, how he had to have the nobles live in the capital to keep an eye on him. Well, the system used in the Ottoman Empire was this system, the Dev-Shirme system, where you consolidate power into the hands of the emperor, the sultan, by taking Christian boys who don't have any clan loyalties, who are not Turks, therefore they don't have to be loyal to any noble, and you raise them to be loyal to you. And you make them your most trusted advisors. You give them the highest positions because you took them as children and then you essentially raise them to be your power base. So by the time they're older, men, they're luxury, they live in luxury, they're treated well by the emperor. Yes, they are taken by force, but they're raised, in a way that by the time they're older, they don't realize the impact of that, right? They've developed this loyalty to the emperor. And that was a very effective system that gave the emperor a strong, loyal following of both military leaders and civil servants. So a couple of sultans you want to know. One of them is Mehmed the Conqueror. And he's the one who leads the conquest of Constantinople. That painting there is a painting of the walls of Constantinople being finally destroyed. Constantinople was a Roman city. It became the Roman capital in the 300s. And for over 1,000 years, those walls protected it. While the Byzantine Empire declined and declined, Constantinople remained a powerful city. Even though they lost control of the rest of the empire, that city was still firmly under the control of the Byzantine rulers, the descendants of the Roman rulers. And it was this really thick wall that protected the city. It was impenetrable, right? Until the development of gunpowder. This is also when you start to see cities and towns no longer having walls and castles no longer building walls around their towns, because gunpowder changes the game. Now you could just blow the walls up. And so Mehmed conquers Constantinople, and he is the ruler of two lands. He's controlling lands in Asia and in Europe. And he lays the foundation for a strong, centralized, absolute monarchy and leads the expansion further into Europe. His navy is going to dominate the Black Sea, and he's going to be engaged in naval warfare with the Venetians, which at the time were the powerful European traders on the Mediterranean Sea. Now, something significant. This time period we're studying is 1450 to 1750. And the reason we started at 1450 is partly because of this event, the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, and the building of a powerful navy discourages Europeans from seeking trade to India because they know they have to go through the Venetians or through the Ottomans. And that's what prompts the voyages of Columbus. So the Columbian exchange and the voyages of Columbus were the game changer. But that doesn't happen without these events in 1453. Another significant ruler is Suleiman the Magnificent, who continued the expansion, and that's when the Ottomans reached their peak under his reign. So he campaigns into Austrian land, the Habsburg family of Austria. And in 1529, they lay siege to Vienna. In 1534, he conquers Baghdad, and under Suleiman the Magnificent, they become a major naval power in the Mediterranean and in the Red Sea, as well as a formidable force in the Indian Ocean. Now, looking at Persia, we're going to look at the second empire, which is the Safavid Empire. And so this is, you could see there's going to be land that overlaps with the Ottomans because they're going to actually, have conflict with the Ottoman Empire. But this land is Persia, so you should be familiar again with the map. You could see to the west of Persia you could see a little bit of Anatolia, a little bit of the Black Sea. Here we have Persia with the Caspian Sea to the north and the Persian Gulf, and then down the Indian Ocean to the south. So the Safavid Empire goes from 1501 to 1722, and it was founded by Shah Ismail, who invades Tabriz and proclaims himself the Shah. So these are Persians. And he proclaims himself Shah in 1501. And he makes a religion, Twelver Shi'ism, the official religion. This was a religion that said that there were hidden imams, which are these religious teachers following Muhammad, that there have been 12 infallible imams, and Ismail was the 12th one, right? And that becomes the state religion, this idea that teaching that this ruler was this one guy. There was 12 leaders after Muhammad, and the 12th one went into hiding in the year 800, and now it's the year 1501, but he claims he is still him, right? That he went into hiding and he's still alive, and he founds a religion on that. And so that becomes known as Twelver Shi'ism, or the Shi'ism. Sometimes it's just called Shi'ism. So he seeks to expand into Anatolia, into the Caucasus, into Mesopotamia and Central Asia, but the problem is there are already empires there, so he's going to come into conflict with the Ottomans, especially as he tries to go into Anatolia. So you could see from this map where the Ottoman Empire in purple and the Safavid under Shah Ismail, where they're going to overlap. So the Safavids trace their ancestry back to a religious leader, Sufi al-Din, and they made his shrine the royal residence that you see pictured here. They also changed their own origin story and religion several times to maintain power. So there's, when you study the Safavid history, it was a history of opportunists, right? People who changed where they came from or who they came from several times to suit the times. And they adopted religion that appealed to the incoming Turks. So here's a couple more pictures you could see of the royal residence of the Safavid. So again, 12er Shi'ism is this religion that after Muhammad there were 12 infallible imams, and when the last one went into hiding in 874, he said he would return to spread the true religion, and they claimed that that was Shah Ismail. So a group of followers called the Red Hats, the Kizilbash, accepted Ismail was the 12th imam, and they became the source of legitimacy. So again, looking at how empires claim legitimacy or consolidate power, in the Safavid, legitimacy came from religion by claiming that their founder was this holy religious figure, right? And therefore, that's why they should have power. And they were supported by a powerful religious group, right? The Kizilbash, and they call them the redheads because of the red coverings on their head or their hats. Now, the Ottoman Empire, they don't like this idea. They don't like this propaganda of Shah Ismail claiming he's an infallible imam, right? The Ottomans are like, no, this can't be a guy who lived hundreds of years ago. And that idea is dangerous to the Muslims in our country. And so the Ottomans feared the spread of the Shiite propaganda, and they went to war. And so one of those key battles is the Battle of Chaldiran, and you may see this on your exam. Okay, so Selim the Grim of the Ottoman Empire invades Persia in 1514 with that premises that, either accept Islam the way we have it, or we're going to invade you and make you do it. And the Ottomans defeated the Safavid, but they can't topple the empire. So they win the battle, but they can't topple the empire. The Safavid remains, it just remains a smaller empire. The most significant ruler you should know here is Shah Abbas the Great, who ruled from 1588 to 1689, right? So 100 years. He moved the capital to Isfahan, and he begins to encourage trade. He reforms the military because they had noticed they'd fallen behind because they hadn't adopted gunpowder. So they reformed the military, they formed alliances with others, and he managed to expel the Portuguese from Hormuz. The Portuguese, remember when they went into the Indian Ocean, you read about in the previous chapter, they forced their way into Persia. They made them open up the port of Hormuz to the Portuguese using gunpowder. So now with this stronger military, he forces them out. And this was the royal residence of Isfahan. So this is in today what is the country of Iran. And then the third empire we're going to look at is the Mughal Empire. And Mughal comes from the word Mongol. Okay, so these are descendants of Mongols who found this empire. So they are not from India. And again, from the map, you could see 1605 in yellow, and then by 1707 in orange. And this is the empire that is the largest of all the Indian empires. No one had ruled all of India. And even the Mughals, you could look at the map, they still don't rule all of India. There's still the southern tip that's not conquered. But they managed to rule more of India than any other empire before. It was founded by Babur, or Babur the Great, who was a Chagatai Turk. So again, from Central Asia, he claimed to be a descendant from Genghis Khan and Tamerlane. So Tamerlane was a descendant of Genghis Khan. And he sought to build a Central Asian empire and gain wealth. So his idea was to build an empire in Central Asia, but he went to raid India to gain wealth. So he invades India with the aid of gunpowder, and he conquers Delhi in 1526. And he establishes a loosely knit empire that runs from Kabul, which is in Afghanistan, to Bengal, where the Bay of Bengal, which is where today um, Bangladesh would be. And he founds a dynasty, the Mongol or the Mughal dynasty. So it's Mongol in the Persian language. And then under the Emperor Akbar, they centralized the administration. So Babur's empire was loosely knit, it was based on alliances, but Akbar consolidates power in Gujarat and Bengal and Vijayanagar. And he was interested in religion and philosophy, and he promoted tolerance because he noted, right, northern India was mostly Muslim since the arrival of the Sultanate of Delhi that we'd read about before, but southern India remained Hindu. So he encourages a divine faith. He encourages a religion that looks at the commonalities of the two instead of the differences. And he was trying to promote tolerance within his empire. So even though he's a Muslim ruler, he's tolerating of Hindus. And that tolerance gains him a lot of respect and a lot of admiration and allows him to have a lot of, influence and power. And then contrast that to Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb pushes Mughal authority deeper into southern India, which is now more Hindu, but he faces rebellions. And rather than having religious tolerance like Akbar, he's breaking with this policy and he's saying, no, we're the rulers and we're Muslim, you're going to follow our religion. So local leaders organize resistance and rebellion, and it's Aurangzeb's attempt at trying to make India all the same that backfires and begins to lead to the weakening of it, right? So another lesson for the modern world, right? So we've seen so far building walls are no longer effective at keeping people out because of technology. And now trying to make everyone all the same and think the same and believe the same doesn't really work when you have a multicultural society. So here you see the Mughal Empire at its extent. Okay, so most of India, except for that little southern tip, so they're going to constantly be facing challenges from the south. So this will be the empire that will eventually get weakened with the arrival of European merchants, and little by little, by the end, by 1750, the Europeans are going to be establishing ports and influence and align with local leaders. And the next time we'll study India, we're going to see how it's pretty much falling to the control of the British East India Company. We're going to talk a little bit about these buildings later in the other lecture, but these are mausolea, something that is an example of monumental architecture that you'll use to compare to the other empires that we've studied. And so a couple of questions I want you to keep in mind. So I'll have a few questions and then we'll end. So one is on the economic front. What are some of the principal commodities that were traded in and out of Islamic states, and which state had the most to offer Western merchants? Because I want you to understand that in the period of 1450 to 1750, with the voyages of Columbus and the American crops that begin to impact the whole world, Europeans start to gain an upper hand in commerce, and they start to become very influential, and they're also beginning to shape the regions that they engage with. So how empires engage with the Europeans is going to play a role in what happens to these parts of the world in the next period we're going to study next semester. So coming into the Ottoman Empire, we have maize, tomatoes, potatoes, tobacco, coffee, sugar, and then being traded out, silk, spices, carpet, ceramics. And it was all about location, right? Location, location, location. The Ottoman Empire was at the crossroads of the trade routes that had been thriving for thousands of years. The Silk Roads, the Mediterranean Sea Lane, the city of Constantinople was so important because it was the middle, right? But now, with the Europeans going around Africa, engaging in the transatlantic slave trade, trading across the Pacific, the new trade routes of this era begin to emerge on the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, so they're no longer the center. They're starting to feel weaker now because they're not as needed in trade as before. So the Ottomans begin to grant trade concessions to England and to France. So they're going to allow Europeans to start coming in and setting up ports, and that's inviting the Europeans in to influence your society. So that's where we're going to begin to see the weakening of these empires. The Safavids allowed Christians to establish monasteries. And then the Mughals were not as focused on trade. So the Mughals did not really engage in trade, but they let people, right, create trading stations and colonies. So they didn't care as long as you paid taxes. The Mughals didn't care if you were an Indian prince, if you were a European merchant from Portugal or from England, so long as you paid the tax. And that's what begins to invite Europeans to set up trading posts. And it's going to be from those trading posts that they're going to slowly begin to gain more and more power over India. And so I want you to also understand the religion, how they treated religious minorities, because that's also important to know for the upcoming exam. Okay, so make sure, you can read about the Wahhabi movement, the conservative Muslims, and what millet communities are. And we're going to talk about this in one of the later lectures, so I'm not going to get too much into it, but just make sure that you read about those before the next lecture. And then how the Safavid treated the Sunni minorities and how they persecuted non-Muslims. And then in the Mughal Empire, understanding the different, I talked a little bit about it, right? The Hindu-Muslim conflict and the differences under Akbar and Aurangzeb. How they treated the Jains, the Zoroastrians, and how they taxed non-Muslims. So lastly, we're going to look at the collapse, right? What led to the economic and military decline of these empires? For economics, the military was costly. It was costly to maintain a centralized administration. And remember, I told you, you needed to keep conquering land to keep giving the soldiers. So that became costly, and the expansion became slower and slower. So they had to raise taxes, they had to sell public offices, and that opened the doors to corruption, bribes, extortion. And it also encouraged Europeans to come in and trade. And as Europeans came in and traded, they started to suck some of that money out of these empires. So money that they needed to run wasn't going to them, it was going to Europeans. And then militarily, they didn't seek to improve military technology. They relied on European expertise. So by the mid-17th century, European weapons were far superior, but the Islamic empires had not upgraded their militaries. So they used outdated weapons. They would buy the old weapons from European armies. And so that, coupled with the not wanting to modernize, right? That cultural conservatism is what begins to lead to their decline. They didn't want to interact with the Europeans. They believed they had nothing to learn from them. And they began to think that the European inventions were damaging to Islamic society. So they removed telescopes. And the Ottomans banned the printing press for fear of ideas that would go against the government. Okay, so this makes these societies weaker, and as Europe grows stronger, they're eventually going to be unable to challenge the Europeans, so they're going to have to kind of do whatever the Europeans want them to do. Okay, so that is it for this lecture. In the next lecture, I'm going to focus on more of the material on what the AP exam really wants you to know. So I'm not going to go over all of the chapter, but I'll go over the points and how it's going to compare to the other societies that we've been studying. Okay, so that's it for this one. I will see you in class.